Today, I'm really excited to have Kevin Huang on the podcast. Kevin Huang is the founder of TruckingUp, a new digital hub for all things trucking. Within TruckingUp, Kevin has created a new startup called Freight Payroll, which is a modern payroll experience for trucking fleets. He also has a really big TikTok channel and a podcast which focuses on the intersection between freight and technology. Prior to TruckingUp, Kevin was a software engineer at Uber and Vinetti. He also created a startup called OpenOps, which was focused on supply chain management for e-commerce. He's also been part of programs such as Y Combinator and On Deck. It was really interesting having Kevin on the podcast because we've seen digital communities really spike up in the last decade. And especially with technologies such as Discord, we see a lot more facilitation of communication between these people who have the similar interest a lot easier nowadays. And to see the way Kevin has structured out Trucking Up so that all the different platforms he's addressing all lead into one another was really, really interesting and was a really great conversation. I didn't think that much about trucking, but after doing a couple hours of research, it's actually a much bigger field than most of us will think about. And so it was really interesting getting some insight from Kevin on it. With that said, I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Hello, Kevin, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me here, Daivik.
Yeah, super excited to have you on. And let's get into it. So I think one of the things that was really unique and one of the reasons I wanted to reach out is, even with a software background, you have a really large interest in trucking and logistics. And it was the first time, when I stumbled onto one of your posts, I didn't realize it's like that took me into realizing how big trucking and logistics actually is. So, I just wanted to first understand, what got you involved in the world of trucking logistics?
I think it was really just like a pure interest. I've been a startup founder for the past 2.5 years. I think as many early stage founders do. I think you kind of like explore different industries. You try to learn about different problems within different industries, and I think part of me was just pretty fascinated by the transportation and logistics industry and having worked at Uber myself. So I think when thinking about starting a company, I think my mind naturally, leaned towards, like the logistics industry. So that's kind of like what brought me into trucking initially. And as I got started, by talking to some other founder friends, I was advised to actually just go to the truck stops and talk to truckers myself to learn more about the trucking industry, rather than just like read all about it. So that was like also kind of like another catalyst that really grew my interest in the trucking industry is by physically going to these truck stops and learning from these truckers. So yeah, that was kind of my foray into the industry.
I see. And then I guess on a side note, but related to that is you mentioned that you founded a couple of startups or your former startup founder. So what got you into the world of entrepreneurship?
Oof. It's just always something I want. I think it's just always something I want to do. I
Right.
think my dad is also also been like a founder all his life. So I would say there's definitely some influence from the old man himself. It's like kind of like growing up, seeing him, working on different companies. I don't even remember how many companies my dad worked on, actually, to be honest with you. But I would say definitely that definitely had a pretty big influence on me as well. And I think so I was born and raised in China, but coming to the US, went to Berkeley, I think it was just like, yeah, it was like one of those things that I was like pretty certain, okay, like this is something I'm gonna do at some point, in my life.
Mhm.
So I would say it's been like a part of me for a very long time, and I think it was only until recently, like I decided to pull the trigger and actually, go full force into it.
Right. Was there like a certain moment you think, like when you were at Uber and you decided that, hey, I think it's time I go do my own startup? Was there like that magic moment for you?
That magic moment was when I got laid off by Uber.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, makes sense. Okay, well, let's get into trucking up. So, you've talked about your interest in trucking. You talked about your interest in, in entrepreneurship. So, what was the motivation behind creating trucking up in particular?
So trucking up really evolved quite a bit. So really, I think when I first got into it, I you probably saw some of my social media channels. It really started out as a TikTok account.
Okay.
It was basically me filming myself going to truck stops, And at some point I share the videos on TikTok, and then that kind of got picked up by truckers, and that kind of became like a pretty interesting way for me to interact with the trucking community and eventually gather kind of accumulated like a bit of a following on
Mhm.
social media. So that was really kind of like the origin of Trucking Up. And it was like me, okay, I have like, a couple of thousand followers, trucking followers, and then trying to figure out, okay, like what are some services or even contents I can provide that are useful to this community and learning through the process.
Right.
But Trucking Up, I think, it really grew from a social media account to right now we are actually working on a specific product in the HR and compliance space for trucking companies. I
Right.
think it's just from talking to a lot of companies, we realized with regulation changing in California specifically, I think a lot of companies and drivers are scrambling, trying to figure out, hey, how do we adapt to this, turbulent times in trucking? How do we, figure out how to comply to regulation? So right now I'm having like having very active conversations with like drivers and trucking companies in the Bay Area, trying to figure out, hey, like what are some software solutions that we can build to
Right.
make their lives easier through a time like this.
Right. And I think like one thing that is very unique is that, I think with any successful startup, you really have to have a deep understanding about your users. And I think what's unique is that with your approach of first starting with social media, making a following like that, and of course getting to meet more and more people, I think you can really get that deep, deep understanding of your users, and you can offer great services to them.
Yeah, no, that was it was kind of unintentional, to be honest with you. I
Okay.
think like um, it really became like a really interesting channel for me to connect with the users and talking to the user like via like social media, and I think that became like a very effective channel for me to do some initial customer research and even testing out some product ideas I had directly via social media. And yeah, it's been really the result has been phenomenal, and I highly encourage anyone when they think about entrepreneurship, actually think about how can you leverage these existing social platforms
Right.
and build that to your advantage.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think, you sort of touched on this is that so you built a social media following, then you start thinking about offering products and services. And I think like in general, like there's a lot more digital communities forming around, whether it be in crypto, whether it be in like sports, like whatever the case is, there's a lot more digital communities. And, in this case, you're facilitating a discussion on trucking on different mediums and in different products and services. So I was just wondering, like, when you think about community building and the future of trucking up, what is your approach to that? Like, how do you like, now that you've had this initial success, how do you keep growing and growing to get more truckers on board?
I think it's really about, well, I think first of all, building something that people want. I think that's a very classic Y Combinator saying, but I think it's really, understanding the community that you're trying to serve and understanding their pain points. And I think that starts with conversations, and be able to provide something, but also get them involved in the process, having those conversations, getting their feedback, iterating based on their feedback. I think that's a really big part of it, which is like the product building. But I think the other part is also just like creating, like, I think community, I think, goes beyond the product. I think that also is like the content and information that you're able to share amongst
Right.
like community members. I think that's also really important. So thinking broader about, hey, like how can I provide value? Because like there's a reason for communities, right? People are coming together for a specific purpose. So understanding what that purpose is, what's the problem that they're trying to solve in their lives, and whether it's creating a product or creating content, I think it all should drive at the same goal of solving some problem for a specific group of people. So I would say that's the biggest thing, just having that kind of like loop of like getting feedback, understanding the problem, and creating solutions. And I think that's like how communities grow. Is like people realize value, and then they will spread to other people,
Right.
and more people kind of get brought into the loop.
Right. And I think what's really interesting is that you have like all these different areas are feeding into each other. And I was just wondering, like, was that an intentional plan you had there to grow the community, or was that more of this unintentional consequence of doing all these different areas?
I will say initially it wasn't super intentional. Initially, it was just like, okay, let me just put some videos out there and see what happens.
Hmm.
But I quickly realized, I think that the community was growing. Like I guess like in terms of community, like my TikTok following was growing really fast. A lot of people are following along with what I'm trying to do, and I realized, oh wow, actually, I think this can be a part of my. Because like I think for me, I my goal was never to be a social media influencer or even like a specific like trucking community builder. That
Right.
really wasn't the goal. The goal was to build a successful business, and I think for me, with my software background, it was more so, hey, like what tools can I create for this community. So I would say like the community I like created initially wasn't intentional, but I think like after it kind of like after I saw its potential, I think I realized, oh wow, this is actually something I can marry into my product development process. So that's kind of like what evolved into like trucking up today, which is like there's obviously the social media part of it, but there's also like the product building part of it. So it's interesting. I have to tell you, I think it's still something very much I'm like figuring out along the way.
Yeah.
I don't have it figured out, but I feel like there's definitely something here. So I'm just gonna keep like going with the momentum and see where it leads me.
Right. And I mean, but you're having constant conversations with your users, so I'm sure that you're going in the right direction, or you're headed that way at least. So that makes a lot of sense. And talking a little bit more about the product. So one of the products that caught my eye was Freight Payroll, which is the modern payroll experience you're building for trucking fleets. And I think in general, finding demographics that haven't been targeted in the past is is makes it pretty ripe for disruptive innovation. Makes a product pretty ripe to really come into the industry and make a big change. So I was just wondering, first off, like when you look into the trucking space, do you think there's a reason why this demographic was ignored or there was no product for it before?
Um, Maybe not this like industry specifically, but I think if you were to look at the way software has been built, I think for the longest time software is very horizontal, meaning the same piece of software, for example, like Salesforce, is created for like it really is intended for like anyone to be able to use it. It wasn't intended for like a specific industry like trucking or agriculture or whatnot. So I think like like the software, I think the initial software development process started with hey, like let's build this horizontal tool for all these industries and try to capture as much market share as possible,
Right.
right? And I think that worked for a long time. But I think right now with um, more and more software being built and businesses becoming more and more specialized, I think the challenges that businesses run into is like, hey, like a horizontal piece of software, sometimes they just might not be able to accommodate the specific needs of a very like niche industry. So for example, with trucking, I think something that like specifically talking about payroll, with trucking, payroll is calculated actually differently from a lot of other industries. So take a pretty standard like blue collar industry, restaurant for example.
Hmm.
Restaurant workers are typically paid by the hour, and most payroll softwares are designed that way. Hey, like you can log how much like someone has worked, and you can calculate the payroll. But with trucking, sure, drivers can get paid by the hour, but they can also get paid by the miles they've driven. They can also get paid by a percentage of a load that they hauled. So there are a lot of different payments, and those are just like a few of the basic ones. And I think there's a lot more complexity in terms of like how trucking payroll can be calculated. And simply for these like horizontal, payroll software, they just cannot accommodate that need.
Right.
And therefore, right now, I think a lot of trucking companies are figuring out their own solutions and building and doing these calculations outside of their payroll software. So I think that's like one specific example of like one how a need of a niche industry is just not being fulfilled by these like traditional like horizontal software players. So I would say there's a lot more examples like that, but I think the evolution that we're seeing is like, hey, like when a group of customer is not being served well by traditional
Yeah.
software, I think new entrants will come up and pop up and try to serve those customers better. So yeah, I think that's kind of like the very much the thesis I have is that hey, like we believe we can build a 10x better experience for this niche group of customers,
Right.
and that is how we will win in the long term.
Right. Yeah, and I think the market itself is also it's a lot bigger than I think people imagine. Like how many truckers are out there, and like if you're not into the space, like I wasn't, and after doing a lot of research, I realized that wow, this is a lot bigger than I thought about, it makes sense the more you start like going into it with how much freight is being transported all over the country or all over the continent. But it's just it's never in the forefront. It's always in the back of your mind. So it was just really interesting to see how big the market was.
Yeah, 100%. It's I think just some high level numbers is about I think the overall freight market in the US is about a 7 to 800 billion dollar industry. And there are about 1.2 million trucking companies. Given that I think a lot of trucking companies are these like small mom and pop shops. 90% of these trucking companies actually have 6 trucks or less.
Right.
90% of them. And I think 97% of them have 20 trucks or less. So you can imagine there's a huge long tail of these like really, really small mom and pop trucking companies. And um, so yeah, I think another thing to know is actually truck drivers are about like 6% of the US workforce. 6%.
Right.
That's a huge number of workers, a huge number of the workforce being truck
Yeah.
drivers. So I think, yeah, this is definitely like a really, really big industry. And I think even within this industry, there's a lot of, like segmentation in terms of like, what type of load people specialize in, what type of like lanes they run. So I think there's a lot of different ways you can, skin the cat. But I think it's definitely like a tremendously big industry with a lot of opportunities.
Right. Yeah, for sure. It's a huge demographic. And yeah, I think like talking a little bit more trucking. I think what's really interesting is some of the innovation that we see in the space. Even even if a lot of it I think is being unjustly ignored. I think there should be a lot more innovation in the space. But still, we're seeing especially like companies like Uber Freight, for example. If I understand correctly, they're offering trucking as a service. So you can put in what end to end destination you want and have that service provided to you. So I was just wondering, like for you, like what do you think when you think about the future of trucking? Like what really excites you, and what do you think the future of trucking will look like with upcoming technologies?
Oh man, that's a loaded question. I think companies like Uber Freight and Convoy, I think that they're definitely are kind of like at the forefront of digitizing one of the most crucial part of the trucking industry, which is load
Hmm.
matching. Because really, like I think like the fundamental of trucking is that, hey, like someone has a load to move and they want to be able to like get it somewhere, like really as efficiently as possible. So I think that is where, like freight brokers typically come in. Freight brokers are, traditionally this middleman that matches, hey, someone has something to ship, and therefore let me find a trucker that can help you to ship that freight from point A to point
Right.
B. And I think Uber Freight and Convoy started this like digitization of freight brokerage in mid 2010. So I think and that has been, I would say, like one of the biggest evolution, I think, in the trucking industry in terms of technology. But I think right now, we are also seeing more digitization on the carrier side, which carriers generally, a carrier means, the trucking companies themselves, meaning like having more tools and products built to help them to streamline their, workflow, help them to find loads more easily. And also, I think right now, specifically for what I'm looking at right now is also automating their back office
Right.
more because I think like back office probably has been one of the most ignored. To be fair, also one of the most boring, parts of the business. So I think like for us, I think like our vision is, hey, like can we build a suite of products that really automates the entire back office as much as possible for trucking companies so they don't need to worry about compliance, they don't need to worry about payroll, HR, and they can just focus on what they do best, which is transporting the load from low A to point A to point
Right.
B. So I think there are definitely a lot of different angles that you can enter in terms of like innovation, but yeah, I know I'm really excited. I think this is definitely like a really big but also slow moving industry. So I think it definitely takes a lot of patience and tenacity to be able to build something long lasting. But I'm definitely excited about the challenge too.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And a little bit of a controversial technology, I guess, in trucking. I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on is I know there's a lot of self driving companies now popping up. Like Embark is one specific for trucking, and of course, we have some other incumbents as well in the industry. So I was just wondering, when it comes to like self driving, technologies, how like what are your thoughts on its long term, like if you think it'll be successful long term, and how the industry will transition while these technologies start getting adopted?
That's a good question. I think as a technologist myself, I absolutely believe that I think self-driving trucks will be a part of the future. There's no question about that. I think it's just a matter of
Hmm.
when. And but I think the question that people always ask, and I think the question is probably, hey, like, will self-driving trucks completely replace
Hmm.
truckers, and would that, just like wipe out like millions of jobs? I think the answer to that is not super binary to me. I don't think it. I don't think I really see a day, or at least like anytime soon in the future that like self-driving trucks will completely replace jobs. But I think it will probably be more of like a gradual process of people figuring out how do we work with self-driving trucks, and how do we like leverage the capabilities of self-driving truck to make truckers' job
Right.
easier. One example I can give you is I always like to draw this analogy of like the commercial airline industry. Even with commercial airlines today, which a lot of them actually fly on autopilot. I'm not sure if
Right.
you know that, but a lot of them actually fly on autopilot. But the reality is, for most commercial flights, you always see a few pilots sit in the cockpit. And I think I see the same relationship with drivers and a self-driving truck, where drivers probably will still, be part of the operation and be there to, take control of the situation if things do
Right.
go wrong. But I think, like with self-driving truck, a lot of the interstate, kind of like the long interstate travels, that can probably be automated, and not having to have driver drive through those like long tedious stretches of
Right.
road, which gives them more break, and they can feeling more refreshed drive through maybe more challenging areas, and maybe also like potentially increasing the safety, safety of trucks on the road. So I would say that's like definitely something like a really plausible future I see with like trucks, autonomous trucks, and drivers working together in the future. I think another note on that is I think another mental model that I have is the hub and spokes model. I'm not
No,
sure if
I'm
you're
not.
familiar with that, but I think the hubs and spokes model is basically, think about cargo when you transport between like big, metropolitan areas. For example, like two cities like Houston and Atlanta. There are long stretches of interstate highway in between. But when you get to these like specific, cities, you need to still do kind of like a more of like a last mile delivery. In those last miles, you're navigating city streets. You are, probably going through more challenging terrains, and therefore, having some kind of like human taking control of that route probably makes a lot more sense than and then having the autonomous vehicle going in between kind of like the long interstate highways, which is a lot more straightforward to drive. So I think that's also another like model that's like very plausible in the
Right.
future.
And I think like if we think about some of the like leading rates of fatality for truck drivers, fatigue is I think up there. Well, like I think that's the biggest one, right? So definitely like that, like self-driving technologies can address that problem a lot, and make sure that there's more freight getting carried around the country. Because if truck drivers don't have as much fatigue, they can probably do more runs as well.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a challenge too, because right now, I think regulation will also need to adapt, because there's actually a hours of service rule, meaning a trucker actually only can operate for 14 hours per
Okay.
day. So meaning like they cannot drive over that, and if they do, that would not be compliant anymore. So that's actually something that will be interesting to see how it might change with self-driving trucks, because I mean, with self-driving truck, as long as you have fuel or battery, you can literally drive forever. So I think that's also like probably like something that will change with the arrival of self-driving truck, but we'll just have to see how that
Right. No,
evolves.
that's gonna be it's gonna be interesting to see what happens. But yeah, thank you so much, Kevin, for coming on the podcast. Before I let you go, I have two last questions. First one being, is there a book or a piece of content that you recommend us checking out?
Um, I'm I think a really good book I read recently was Radical
Mhm.
Candor. I think it's a book about management and how to communicate effectively in the workplace. Basically champions, very open and direct and honest communication. And I think that's something that has really like affected like my style of communication, I think, when it comes to like a workplace. So I think that's definitely a book that I would recommend. And what's your other
Oh yeah,
question?
so the
Sorry, I
other
forgot.
I just asked the first question first. So yeah, no, I'll definitely make sure to check that book out. I haven't heard
Okay.
of it before, but it sounds interesting.
Radical Candor by
Radical
Kim
Candor by
Scott.
Kim Scott. Okay, I will try checking that out. But last question that I have is just what can we look forward to? Like what's next for you in trucking up?
So right now we are pretty heads down working on the product, and we're hoping to launch it within probably the next month or two. I think it's hard to say, but right now we are really. I think that's like probably our biggest focus right now, just really making sure we are talking to customers and we are focusing on building something that can really solve their problems. So looking for stay tuned for that product launch, but hopefully we have something exciting coming through
Perfect,
coming
sounds
soon.
good. Well, thank you once again, Kevin, for coming on the podcast. It was a really lovely conversation. Loved hosting you.
Thanks for having me, David.